Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barbara Kazimbaya-Senkwe. I'm the Senior Wash Governance Advisor for USAID's Water and Hygiene Finance WashFin program, and I am based in our office in Nairobi, Kenya. This afternoon, I'll be talking to you about some work we have been doing under the WashFin activity and focusing specifically on the role of technical assistance in and scaling up innovative sanitation technology. And we will be drawing examples from our work in Senegal and Kenya. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about WashFin very shortly. Right. In terms of the presentation for this afternoon, I'll start by telling you a little bit about USAID's WashFin program. And then I'll talk about the work we've been doing in Senegal and Kenya in support of sanitation service providers that are trying to work with new sanitation technologies. And then I'll say something about the fecal sludge treatment challenge, and then the results of the work that USAID WashFin has been doing in those two countries, and focus then on the lessons we have learned as we do this work. So, USAID WashFin. USAID, as I said, this WashFin is the Water, Sanitation and Hygiene Finance Program. It has the objective of closing financing gaps to achieve universal access to water and sanitation services through sustainable and credit-worthy business models, and also increased public funding and expanded market finance for infrastructure investment. So the program is really focused on looking at financing. How do we bring in more financing into the water sector? Specifically, how do we bring in financing from the markets or the private sector? But at the same time, also recognizing that the public sector has a critical role to play still in terms of increasing funding to the water sector if we are going to reach the SDG number 6 by 2030. Where does WashFin work? We are in 8 countries in Africa and Asia. In Asia, we are in the Philippines, in Cambodia, and in Nepal. And in Africa, we are in Senegal, Kenya, Zambia, Mozambique, and South Africa. But today, I'll only be talking about our work in Senegal and Kenya. WashFin started in 2016 and we will close in 2022 around September. Our budget was about $50 million, and all of that is funded by USAID. Our target when we started WashFin in 2016 was to try and bring to the sector $200 million. So far, we have raised about 61.2, just under $61.2 million. And some of that is going to the countries that I'm talking about this afternoon. So we've been working in Senegal and Kenya. In those two countries, we have a very big focus on sanitation. In Senegal, we only work in sanitation, whereas in Kenya, we do water and sanitation. So today, I'll be talking about our activity in sanitation in Kenya, and then our in Senegal on sanitation. Why are we working in this sanitation space? I think most of us on this session this morning will know that we've still got a big challenge in terms of sanitation across the globe. The World Bank reports that only 43% of the world's urban dwellers benefit from safe sanitation. So you've still got 57% of our population globally not having access to adequate sanitation. And if we look at the treatment of fecal waste, the numbers get even less. Only 18% of on-site domestic fecal waste is treated worldwide. So all the fecal matter which is produced at the household level, only 18% of it is treated worldwide. So we've still got a very big problem there in terms of reaching the safe part of the Sustainable Development Goal on sanitation. Fortunately, there are new decentralized technologies that are emerging as part of the solution. And most of these have a reuse of fecal waste as a key element in these technologies. And these are the technologies that I'll be talking about this this afternoon. How do we expand these technologies? And what we have seen with the WashFin experience is that expanding this technology requires financing from all sources, public and private. And so the thing that I'm sharing with you this afternoon is some of our experience as WashFin program in providing the technical assistance to find this financing that can help us expand these new technologies. And in looking at expanding these technologies, we've identified a number of challenges in the countries that we are working. Is the enabling environment. And then on the other side is the solution provider level challenges. If we start with the enabling environment, most of our countries, Africa, Asia, let's say the developing world or the South as the so-called southern part of our globe, public policy still favors sewers. And I think all of you work with the public sector. Most of our engineers, we are trained as engineers to do large sewer systems. And so when you begin to talk about technologies that are no longer dealing with sewer, it creates a bit of in the public sector because our policy still favors construction of large sewer systems. The other challenge is that the market for these products that are coming out of these innovations, whether you are looking at for replacing charcoal, or you are looking at energy reuse from fecal matter to generate energy. These are still very nascent markets. It's a very, very new area, and it is for a public good. And we know that developing a market for a public good takes a little bit longer than a market for a private good, for the simple reason that you have a lot of politics and other social externalities related to this public good. So we are dealing with an asset market, and there's still a lot of work that needs to happen in that stage. Secondly, or thirdly, most of these innovations, because they are innovations, so you begin with a group of clever ideas, they come up with the technology, but it requires a lot of funding to move from a designed technology to reach commercial scale. And what we have seen, as you will see later, is that it really takes quite a lot in terms of the financing that is required, the policy framework that is required to push these technologies to move from prototypes into scale. And it is a very slow transition. I think we have seen in the case of Senegal, the technology we'll be talking about, it's been around from as far back as 2015, but up to now, we are still dealing with the prototype, and this is in 2021. There's also a conflict amongst the service providers themselves. So if you are a company, you're a small entrepreneur, you've come up with a technology, let's say you are converting fecal matter into briquettes, and you are trying to sell this, as I said, into a market which is public and it is nascent and people don't know about it. You are caught up, in trying to say, do we provide the sanitation service or do we provide technical assistance? And because depending on where you go, if you're going to provide technical assistance, you are then locking yourselves out of being able to get contracts from the public sector. Quite a bit of a conflict for the service providers in terms of where they position themselves. They've got to sell or market the technology. On the other hand, they've got to actually sell the products so that they are viable companies. And this creates quite a bit of tension for the service providers. And again, if we now look at the solution provider level, most of these companies are self-funded. They are new. They've got a limited track record as a service provider, and it also means they've got limited credit history. So they cannot just walk into a bank and say, can I borrow 2 million, Mr. Bank Manager? Mr. Bank Manager does not know them because he has not yet dealt with them. And therefore, what you find is that for most of these companies, they need a lot of grant support in the early years to help them develop the business to a level that the commercial banks or other private equity investors would be interested in looking at them. They need time to build a history. They also, as companies that are coming up, they are because they are self-funded, they tend to be small to medium-sized. And some of the things that you would expect in a large company that has been operating for some time, it's these companies. So we find in the case of both Kenya and Senegal, there's a lot of inadequacy of data at the company level. So even if they wanted to go to an investor to say, can we please talk, would like to get some money, they need to start from zero, putting together the type of data that is required, especially if you're looking at commercial financials. Also, we find that there's a lot of inadequacy of manpower because these are startups, so like any other startup in any sector, they face similar challenges. You have inadequate manpower, and in many cases, we've had to move in and provide some backup support, especially on the finance skills that are required to deal with the private sector. And then finally, there's a limited experience with both commercial and public financials. Mostly when you talk about the commercial banks, yes, depending on where the company has been set up, they may have good experience with the commercial banks, but generally we find that they need a lot of help to understand what is it that these types of financials are looking for. And then when it comes to the public sector side, the whole idea of how services are procured in the water sector, especially where you have development partners financing most of this, these companies need to understand how does the World Bank procure, how does AFDB procure, and that means they need more time to settle down and understand really how do we get money from these different financing sources. So, what has been the WASHFIN response to these challenges? So WASHFIN seeks to leverage and align grant funding. And I think this is important, that we are not saying that we are trying to replace grant funding, because like I said, we need the grant funding. So we try and find ways in which we can leverage that grant funding with return-seeking investment. So anybody else who's looking at what money I would like to invest in sanitation, but I would like to make a return. The question that we ask ourselves as WASHFIN is, how do we leverage the publicly available grant funding with return-seeking investments together with government investments so that we can help to support to balance the technology development with market creation for the services and solutions, because in terms of the need for sanitation services such as this is very much there, but the effective demand, that is not there, and that has to be created, and that is the space that we try and occupy as a WASHFIN program. And as the examples I'm sharing here, we targeted in this area a very small subset of the sanitation service providers. We only worked with one in Senegal and one in Kenya. Now, that is not to say we didn't work with other SSPs. We did work, especially in Senegal. We worked with over 100 sanitation service providers, but only in one case was there innovation in sanitation technology. And that is the one that I'm talking about today. We also concentrated on technologies that focus on reuse of fecal matter, because that also contributes to one of our targets, which is leveraging money for climate change purposes. So anything we can do to reuse materials we know contributes to conserving or dealing in some way with the climate change issue. Our engagement is focused solely on raising investment capital. So we don't get involved, for instance, in the first parts of the sanitation value chain. We are not involved in construction of toilets. We are not involved really in the transportation of fecal matter. Our engagement has been on raising investments for the sanitation solutions themselves. So expanding factories, expanding production of these materials coming from these new technologies. And as I'm sharing today, we are in the process of documenting our learning, both what we have seen from a practical point of view, but also some of those theoretical and conceptual issues. How do we move, from pilot prototype technologies into scaling up? And those are some of the things that we are trying to document. And this presentation is therefore part and parcel of that process of us trying to document our experience. So when we go to the actual support, in the case of Senegal, we supported a company called Delvic. We worked with them to prepare market studies on the inputs and outputs of the machine. And this is a machine called Omni Processor. Most of you will have heard about it. It came in under the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, reinventing the toilet agenda. So it produces water, electricity, and ash. And our inputs were to work with Delvic to figure out what else did they need on the stock feed side. So we worked to help them think through the solid waste as part and parcel of the stock feed that would go into the machine to make sure that they had enough stock feed beyond the fecal matter. But we also worked with them on the supply side of their equation. What is it you want to sell, which from a commercial point of view makes sense? You are producing water, electricity, ash. Is this really the space you want to build your business as a business on? So we provided a lot of support there in thinking through, and a lot of studies around which would be the best place to locate the company as a business. And then we help them refine their financial model and the business plan. So having said, okay, from what we can see, you are able to focus on this particular product. Now, for you to take it to market and be able to make money out of it, you need a financial model that reflects that together with a business plan. So we help them prepare that as well. And then we worked with them on the actual capital raise strategy. How do we then go out there and get money for you to be able to expand and produce the materials you want to produce and be able to go to the market and sell, make the sales that you are looking for. Ultimately, we did then work with them on preparation of investor outreach materials so that as they are going out to sell themselves to the people with the financing or the funding, they've got materials which are investor facing and not necessarily looking at the company, but what is it that an investor would be interested in seeing or hearing about what Delvic is trying to do. So that was part of our work in Senegal. In Kenya, it was a similar process. We've been working with Sanitation. Sanitation converts fecal matter into briquettes and logs to replace charcoal. So in their case, we worked with them on setting up a monitoring system for their business operations. They wanted to know, how do we know what inputs we should be bringing into the factory at which time? And then on the outputs, how do we monitor to check that our outputs are actually in line with what we have projected as a company? And how do we use that to project where we should? We also worked with Sanitation on an investor landscape assessment because they wanted to know who could be their potential financiers or funders. So we did an investor landscape assessment to help them identify potential people that could finance their activities. We then went on and worked on the demand side, looking at identification of the market. Where else could Sanitation go? Right now, they operate in Naivasha. And the question was, is there anywhere else in Kenya where they could expand their activities? So we did a market identification and segmentation for them to allow them to expand. And then similar to Delvic, we worked with them on preparing a financial model and a business plan for expansion and preparation of investor outreach materials. Very, very similar to what I explained about Delvic. So what have been our results? In terms of Sanitation in Kenya, we've produced quite a number of things for them. We did, like I said, the wash market assessment and segmentation. Now, if you go to Sanitation, they'll tell you they're thinking of expanding to town A, town B, and they are thinking about doing this and that in that particular time, in that particular town. That came from the market assessment that we did with them. But we also worked with them on assessing partnerships with WASH institutions, especially on the public sector side. Like I said, the public sector really has a critical role to play here in creating that enabling environment for these companies. So how do they link with companies like Sanitation? How do they know that what Sanitation is doing is important work which they can build upon? So we did a lot of work there, and this resulted in quite a number of partnership assessments for Sanitation with WASH institutions. We also worked on enhancement of the Sanitation factory model. So they've been thinking about how they can expand the work they are doing in Naivasha. They have investor-facing financial model, and we also help them develop a performance operational dashboard so that at any time they can really see how are we performing both on the factory floor, but also on the business side. And we did prepare for them a financial teaser, and I'm very happy to report that for Sanitation, we have helped them raise about just over $3 million in the last 2 years. And this is in both grants as well as convertible debt. So what were the results in Senegal? We did work with Delvic, as I said. We've left them with a financial model and a financing teaser for them to use as they go out to talk to different potential investors and financiers. We did do quite a lot on coaching and individualized capacity building support. As I said, we found that there was a bit of a weakness on the manpower side, especially in relation to finance. So we worked with their finance team to really give them some capacity building at an individual level. We also provided the report on solid waste opportunities, which, as I said, were important in creation of both stock feed for the Omni processor, but also for just other potential opportunities for the company as well. And then we did also give them a report on the coolant market as one of the outputs of the Omni processor with the potential to go to market. Unfortunately, in the case of Senegal, we have not yet been able to help Delvic raise any funding or financing. That is not to say that the work has stopped. This work is still ongoing, and our hope is that in the next few years or so, the company will be able to raise the funding and financing that they require from the different potential investors. So what have we learned? I think the first thing is that we know, having done this work, that funding opportunities exist for these new technologies, but they must be matched with grants and repayable. It must be a mix of grants and repayable sources. Repayable sources on their own, we are still not at that point yet. We still need quite a bit of grant financing in order for these technologies, one, to be accepted, appreciated by the market, and that is in terms of the consumers themselves, but also to be appreciated by the governments who, by and large, are the ones that have the bulk of the resources that are required to invest in the sanitation infrastructure. The other thing, which may not be surprising, is that proving these technologies is time and resource consuming, and it must pay attention, anticipate many externalities. When we worked with Delvic, the whole issue of solid waste came in because it became clear that getting fecal matter to the plant alone would not be sufficient to run the machine. You needed another way in which you could consolidate the stock feed. And so we had to stop and start thinking, how can we bring in solid waste into this machine to make it work? And as I speak now, there's the experimentation with the new OP that is supposed to go to Senegal has still been ongoing. So these things take a lot of time and resources. And I think those who are entering that space just need to be aware that this is not, this is a marathon and not a sprint. The other thing that we are quite convinced is that the only way we are going to upscale these technologies, we have to create effective demand for these technologies as a public good through government engagement. And I think this is in terms of the policies. What is government thinking about how they want to serve the populations in their urban areas, where many people live in informal settlements? They are probably never going to get connected to a sewer system. How do we begin then to look at these technologies from a public point of view as part and parcel of the solution, and put in place policies, standards that would help to push the use of these technologies? But beyond that, I think governments must really pay attention to funding and procurement of these new technologies. Like I said, in the case of Kenya, it's been a very interesting journey because you have the big banks, World Bank, Africa Development Bank, putting in large sums of money into sanitation. But when you look in those programs, mostly they are still focused on sewage or pit latrines. Yeah. So the question is, how do we begin to change some of this so that when you have a large project funded by a multilateral or even a bilateral, that the issue of these technologies is built in as part and parcel of the solution to sanitation? And until we do that, it will be very difficult for us to upscale these technologies because they need a lot of money to be able to scale up. Finally, we need to explore how to incentivize governments to create an enabling environment that can leverage private capital for these innovative technologies. It is true, I've said this a few times and I'm going to repeat it. Governments all over the continent are still in love with the sewerage. Yeah, we have to find a way in which we can get our governments to begin to see that these are the technologies, the ones that we're talking about today, the new innovative technologies that reuse waste, but also other simpler sanitation solutions are really part and parcel of the solution in the African context. And it will not happen anyhow. I think those of us working in the sanitation space must really take it as a deliberate move, to think about what is it that our government policymakers need to know? What is it they need to do? How can we help them see that there is value in us promoting these innovative technologies? Because not only do they help us reach the SDG aspect of safety, but it is also environmentally much more friendly. And it can also, as we know, it can also help create quite a lot of jobs within our communities. So there's a lot of work that we as specialists in this area need to do to help our governments to move in this area. So I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm looking forward to a lively discussion with you so we can exchange and learn from one another. Thank you so much.